It feels like, every day the news is just one surprise after another.
It really does.
And it's like increasingly difficult to figure out what's really going on.
Right, like what actually matters beneath all the noise and chaos.
Yeah, exactly. And it's exactly why we're here today to try and,
Cut through that noise.
exactly, to take a deep dive, so to speak.
Love that
Yeah.
deep dive.
So today we're diving into, well, a whole stack of recent articles from The Economist.
I love their articles. Always so insightful.
Really covers the whole spectrum of what's going on. I mean, we've got articles about global politics,
Yeah, some wild stuff happening there lately.
definitely, but then also, really fascinating breakthroughs in technology.
Oh, yeah. Can't forget about that.
And then, of course, all the social trends, how people are changing, how we're all kind of living these days.
Right, and how the business world is trying to keep up.
Absolutely. So that's our mission today, basically, to really sort through all of this, pull out those key takeaways, the things that might surprise you, and hopefully, I don't know, help you understand the world just a little bit better.
And maybe even catch a glimpse of what the future might hold.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So maybe the best place to start is with some of the, well, let's call them shakeups in the global political landscape.
Yeah, good place to start because, a lot of these technological advancements and social trends we'll talk about are, like, in some way shaped by what's happening on the geopolitical stage.
For sure. So let's head over to Syria first. There seems to be something potentially big brewing in the Northeast.
Okay.
So there's this deal being worked out between Mr. Shara, I believe he's the interim leader there at the moment, and the Turkish-backed Syrian Democratic Forces, the SDF.
Ah, interesting.
Yeah, and the goal here is to basically bring the SDF back under the control of the Syrian government.
So potentially a big shift for a region that's been pretty much autonomous for the past decade.
Right. If it goes to, I mean, it could really redraw the map of the Syrian conflict.
And possibly even have ripple effects across the entire Middle East.
No doubt. Makes you wonder,
Oh.
why now? What's changed that suddenly they're willing to come to the table?
Good question. Definitely something to keep an eye on.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, over in Israel, the situation with Gaza continues to be tense, as always.
Wow.
And Israel's actually taken the step of cutting off the electricity supply to Gaza.
Wow.
Yeah, their energy minister, Eli Cohen, was pretty upfront about it. He said, and I quote, "This is a tool to pressure Hamas and other Palestinian groups to return the hostages."
I mean, that puts into perspective the incredibly difficult choices governments face when dealing with hostage situations.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Like, how do you balance applying pressure with, well, the human cost?
Right, because a move like that's bound to affect the everyday lives of ordinary people living in Gaza.
Exactly.
Difficult situation all around.
And speaking of the region, it seems there might be a glimmer of hope, at least diplomatically. It seems, under some nudging from the U.S., that Israel and Lebanon have agreed to start talking about their border.
Oh, that's good news. That's a long-standing dispute, isn't it?
It is. And as a gesture of goodwill, Israel has released 5 Lebanese prisoners.
Okay, so that's a positive step. Could be a sign that maybe, just maybe, things are moving towards de-escalation.
Yeah, I mean, the U.S. involvement is interesting, too. It seems like they're really pushing for a resolution.
Yeah, makes you wonder what their end game is.
Definitely something to watch. Okay, let's hop across the Atlantic for a moment to North America. Things are getting a little frosty between the U.S. and Canada.
Oh, really? I thought they were, best buddies.
Well, yeah, traditionally they've had a very close relationship.
Right.
But Mark Carney, you remember him, right? Former governor of both the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England.
Oh, yeah.
Well, he's just become the leader of Canada's Liberal Party, and he's pretty much guaranteed to be the next prime minister.
Okay.
And he's already making waves.
What's he up to?
Well, he came out with this warning about, and I quote, a predatory America.
Whoa, strong words.
Yeah, and he specifically called out Trump's past threats to impose tariffs, even questioned the U.S.-Japan Defense Treaty.
Interesting. I mean, given the history there with the whole Roosevelt-King Edward VII border thing and even recent comments from, Kristi Noem and all that.
Right, yeah.
Well, it shows there's a real underlying anxiety in Canada about potential U.S. actions.
Absolutely, and Carney's not exactly mincing words.
Definitely a departure from the usual diplomatic niceties. So what's Trump's reaction been?
Oh, he's fired back on Twitter, of course.
Yeah.
Called Carney weak and a puppet of globalists.
Oh, boy. Here we go again.
Yeah. So definitely a relationship to watch. Could have some interesting consequences. Okay, back to Europe now. So news on the Ukraine front.
Okay, what's happening there?
Well, Seems like the U.S. has brokered this proposal for a 30-day ceasefire.
A ceasefire. Wow. So that means,
Ukraine has agreed to it, at least in principle, during talks in Jeddah. And get this, the U.S. is also going to start sending weapons to Ukraine again.
oh, wow. So they're really stepping up their involvement.
Yeah, it seems like they're trying to kind of tip the scales,
Wise.
maybe force a negotiated settlement.
I see. But what about Russia? Are they on board?
They've been pretty cautious so far. Putin's made it clear repeatedly that he's got long-term goals in Ukraine.
Yeah. And those are...
Basically, he wants to annex Ukrainian territory and make sure Ukraine stays neutral, no joining NATO or anything like that.
Right. So a ceasefire might be a tactical move, but it doesn't really change his overall strategy.
Exactly. And it's interesting, you look at the different reactions within Russia.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so you've got these like hardcore war bloggers, very nationalistic. They're totally against any kind of ceasefire.
Figures.
But then a recent poll by the Levada Center, which is a pretty reputable polling organization in Russia,
Okay.
well, their poll showed that a lot of ordinary Russians actually want peace talks.
Interesting. So there's this internal pressure on Putin.
Yeah, exactly. And then on top of all of that, there's talk of a new European reassurance force.
A what?
Yeah, a military force, potentially like 20,000 to 30,000 troops that could be sent to Ukraine.
Wow. Okay. So if a more stable ceasefire happened, they'd move in to, like, keep the peace.
Yeah, something like that.
I mean, that really shows you how worried Europe is about, the U.S. not being a reliable security partner anymore.
Exactly. And that ties directly into this whole rearmament trend that's sweeping across Europe.
Yeah. Countries are boosting their defense budgets, getting ready for a future where they might have to go it alone.
Exactly. And it's fascinating to see how different countries are approaching it.
How so?
Well, like Poland's going all out. They want to spend almost 5% of their GDP on defense.
Wow. That's a lot.
Yeah, but then you've got countries like France and Spain. They're facing all sorts of budgetary constraints and political pushback, too.
Yeah, makes sense. Makes you wonder how unified Europe really is when it comes to defense.
For sure. And the debate's getting pretty heated, especially with NATO considering raising its spending targets even higher.
Higher. How high are we talking?
Well, the current target's 2%, but they're talking about maybe bumping it up to 3.6% or even 3.7%.
Wow, that's a big jump.
Yeah, and not everyone's happy about it. But, I mean, NATO's got to adapt to the new reality, right?
Yeah, I mean, with the U.S. becoming less reliable, Europe's got to step up.
Exactly.
Mhm.
And this whole situation really reflects the larger shift we're seeing in U.S. foreign policy under Trump,
Yeah, how would you describe it?
Well, it's this mix of strong-arming allies and cutting deals with adversaries, like very transactional.
I see what you mean.
It's like, remember when they froze aid to Ukraine and then suddenly restored it?
Right.
Or the tariffs on Canada out of the blue?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then, of course, there's the whole questioning of the U.S.-Japan treaty.
Exactly. It's all very well. America first.
Right. And understandably, a lot of America's traditional allies are feeling a little, shall we say, nervous.
Definitely. And it seems like, economically,
Yeah.
there's this big push towards economic nationalism.
Meaning?
Well, things like reciprocal tariffs.
Tit for tat.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And even talk of like intentionally weakening the dollar, which could have some pretty serious global repercussions.
No doubt. Oh, and one last thing before we move on.
Okay.
I got to mention Marco Rubio. It's kind of fascinating how his stance has evolved.
How so?
Well, he used to be super hawkish on Russia, remember? But now, as Secretary of State, he was instrumental in getting that Ukraine ceasefire offer on the table.
It shows you international diplomacy is rarely straightforward.
Definitely not. Okay, let's shift gears now, dive into the world of technology.
Love it. So much happening there so fast.
It's mind-blowing. And of course, it's all tied up with the global politics we were just talking about.
Absolutely. Technology is not just some neutral tool. It's like reshaping the world, often in ways we don't even see coming.
Right. So first up, we've got this thing called Manus AI. It's from China. Okay, and what's so special about it?
Well, they're calling it the world's first general AI agent that's actually out there in the real world.
Whoa, okay. As opposed to just in a lab somewhere.
Exactly. And get this, it can perform tasks without needing specific instructions from a human for each step.
Whoa, that's pretty wild.
Oh,
So
wow.
it's like making its own decisions.
In a sense, yeah. And the potential is huge. I mean, imagine the possibilities.
I can. But also the potential dangers, right?
Absolutely. I
Yeah.
mean, how do you control something like that?
Right. Like, what are the ethical considerations? How do you regulate it?
Exactly. Especially
Huh.
because they're describing it as fully unleashed, which is a little unnerving.
Yeah, a little bit, especially when you compare it to like DeepSeek.
Right, right.
They've been making their AI models open source.
Totally different approach,
Yeah, like anyone can access and modify their technology.
which has its own set of pros and cons, right?
Definitely. It's this whole debate about like what's the best way to develop AI? How much control do we need? Who gets to decide?
It's a big question. Okay, let's talk about self-driving cars for a minute.
Oh yeah, how's it going?
Well, there's this growing sense, especially in China, that we might be on the verge of a chat GPT moment with autonomous vehicles,
Meaning,
like a certain breakthrough where the technology just explodes and everyone's using it.
I see. So is China leading the way?
It seems like it, yeah.
Yeah.
A company called XPeng is making some major strides, and the government's really backing the industry.
That makes sense. China's always been very forward-thinking when it comes to technology adoption.
Absolutely. But, the article does point out that there are still some big hurdles to overcome.
Like what?
Well, obviously safety is a major concern.
Of course.
And then there's the whole question of liability. Like if a self-driving car gets into an accident, who's responsible?
Right, right. It's a legal minefield.
Yeah. And then, you have things like that recent recall of electric vehicles by Xiaomi.
Oh, yeah, I read about that.
It's a reminder that even with all this fancy technology, things can still go wrong.
Absolutely. So self-driving cars, maybe not quite ready for prime time yet?
Not quite. Okay, let's talk chips.
Chips, like potato chips.
Uh-huh. No, not potato chips. Computer chips, microchips.
Ah, okay. The brains of our devices.
Exactly. So there's this Dutch company, ASML. They're pretty much the king of the hill when it comes to EUV lithography.
EUV what now?
It's a really complex process, basically how they make the tiniest, most advanced computer chips.
Ah, okay. So without ASML.
No high-end smartphones, no supercomputers, no AI.
I see. So they've got a pretty important role to play.
Absolutely. And it's a huge challenge for any other company to try and catch up.
Makes sense.
But there are some potential disruptors on the horizon.
Ah.
Yeah, like Canon, they're developing this alternative technology called nano-imprint lithography.
Okay. And what's the advantage of that?
Well, it could be cheaper, maybe more compact too.
Interesting.
And then there's also this super futuristic possibility of using particle accelerators to create EUV light.
Whoa. Particle accelerators, like the things they use to smash atoms.
Yep, those ones.
Wow, okay. So the chip-making landscape could look very different in a few years.
Definitely. And finally, in the tech realm, there's this anxiety in Europe about relying on, you know, companies like Starlink for satellite internet,
Yeah, I can see why.
especially with all the uncertainty around U.S. foreign policy.
Exactly. What if the U.S. decides to, like, cut them off or something?
Right. So Europe's actually developing their own satellite system called Iris-2.
Smart move. Sovereignty in the digital age.
Absolutely. Okay, let's shift gears again, look at some domestic issues and social trends.
Okay, sounds good. What's catching your eye?
Well, in the UK, there's this, really concerning rise in the number of people claiming disability benefits.
No, that's not good.
No, it's becoming a major contributor to worklessness in the country.
I mean, that has all sorts of knock-on effects, right?
Yeah, it impacts inflation, overall economic productivity.
Yeah.
It's a big problem.
So what are they doing about it?
Well, they're trying to reform the system, obviously. There's this pilot program in Barnsley that's trying to, connect people with training and job opportunities.
Okay, so a more proactive approach.
Yeah, instead of just handing out benefits. And then there's this whole debate about return to office mandates.
Oh, yeah, that's a hot topic everywhere.
It is, and it seems like it's disproportionately impacting women, especially those with kids.
Yeah, makes sense. It's hard enough to balance work and family as it is.
Absolutely. And speaking of the UK, British politics are getting pretty interesting.
Really? What's going on?
Well, Nigel Farage, the Brexit guy.
Oh, yeah, him.
He's back with his new party, Reform UK.
And
And they're gaining a lot of support. Seems like they're tapping into the frustration with both Labour and the Conservatives.
I can see that. Like, people are disillusioned with the status quo.
Exactly. It'll be interesting to see how they do in the upcoming by-election. That'll be a real test.
For sure.
Oh, but even with all this momentum, they're having some internal drama, too.
Oh, really?
Yeah, some guy named Mr. Lowe got suspended from the party. Not sure all the details, but
Yeah, internal squabbles are never good for optics.
definitely not. Okay, this one might surprise you.
Hit me.
There's data showing that teenagers and young adults' mental health has actually been improving in recent years.
Really? That's unexpected.
Yeah, after A decade of decline, it seems like the trend's reversing.
Wow. So is social media not the big bad wolf everyone thought it was?
It's complicated, the research is mixed, but this data definitely challenges that assumption.
Interesting. So maybe there's hope for the younger generation after all.
Maybe. Okay, let's talk about the U.S. government for a bit. Some interesting developments there, to say the least.
Yeah, under Trump, it seems like there's always something brewing.
For sure. So the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention,
Yeah.
they're having a bit of a rough time.
How so?
Well, it seems like this entity called DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, is really shaking things up.
And not in a good way.
Not really. There was this, internal email that got leaked called Fork in the Road.
What was that about?
Basically, a bunch of senior staff were threatening to resign.
Wow. Over what?
Well, seems like DOGE is trying to force this whole ranking system on employees. Like, the bottom 10% get fired every year.
Oh, yikes. That's pretty brutal.
Yeah, and they've been putting all these restrictions on communication, too.
So it's like a climate of fear.
Pretty much. And the scientists at the CDC are feeling it the most.
How so?
Well, they're, resorting to using encrypted messaging and stuff because they're worried their emails are being monitored.
Wow. That's a little paranoid, no?
Maybe, but, if you were in their shoes.
Yeah, I guess it's better to be safe than sorry.
And it's not just the CDC. The Department of Education's workforce has been slashed in half.
Really?
Yeah, and the Trump administration has always said they want to get rid of the department entirely.
Well, that's not exactly a secret.
No, but to actually start dismantling it,
It's a big move.
it is. And then, there's this whole thing with the law firm Perkins Coie LLP.
I haven't heard about this one.
So the administration basically ordered all their government contracts to be canceled and their security clearances revoked.
Wow. Why?
Seems like it's because they've done work for Democrats in the past.
Oh, okay. So it's political payback.
Pretty.
I mean, that's pretty worrying.
It is, yeah. Like, what's to stop them from targeting other firms?
Exactly. It sets a dangerous precedent.
Okay, let's talk about trade for a minute. These new tariffs on aluminum and steel.
Yeah. What's the verdict?
Well, it's a mixed bag. I mean, some domestic producers are definitely happy,
Right. Less competition.
but it's also driving up costs for other American companies, like construction equipment manufacturers, can makers.
Yeah, because they use those materials as inputs.
Exactly. And the stock
Yeah.
market's not happy either. There was a big sell-off recently.
So it's like a ripple effect.
Exactly. And then, in terms of international aid, Marco Rubio, as Secretary of State, have canceled a ton of U.S. aid programs.
Really? How many?
Like 83%.
Whoa, that's a lot.
Yeah. And the State Department's taking over the remaining contracts.
So it's like a centralization of power.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Okay, let's talk about immigration.
Always a hot topic.
It is. So there's this new argument emerging. They're calling it the new economics of nativism.
Okay, and what's that all about?
Well, it's basically saying that immigration is bad, not just for the economy.
Which is the usual argument, right?
Exactly.
Hmm.
But also for, the culture, the social fabric of the country.
So they're saying it undermines national identity.
Something like that, yeah. It's a pretty controversial argument, of course.
I can imagine.
And there's a lot of evidence that actually contradicts it.
Right, like studies showing that immigrants actually boost the economy, especially the high-skilled ones.
Exactly. But this new economics of nativism is gaining traction, so it's something to watch.
Definitely.
Okay, complete change of pace now. Let's talk about Christian media.
Christian media, okay.
Yeah, it's booming right now.
Really? Like what kind of stuff?
Streaming content, mostly. Shows, movies.
And it's doing well.
Yeah, really well. It's super profitable.
Wow, that's interesting.
There's a show called The Chosen that's a huge hit.
Haven't seen it.
It's about the life of Jesus. Very high production value.
So is it like a backlash against secular media?
Maybe. I mean, it definitely reflects the cultural climate in America.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, let's talk books for a minute.
Always down for a good book.
So there's this novel called The Dream Hotel by Layla Lalami.
Okay. What's it about?
Well, it's kind of a commentary on technology and how it's creeping into our lives.
So like a dystopian thing?
Kinda, yeah. It draws some parallels to China's social credit system and even America's private prison complex.
Whoa, that's pretty heavy.
It is, yeah. Makes you think about the trade-offs we make for convenience.
Definite.
And then there's this book about Jane Austen.
Love Jane Austen.
Me too.
Yeah.
So the book's called Jane Austen's Bookshelf. And it's all about these female writers that Austen herself admired, but who have been kind of forgotten.
Oh, that's interesting. Like lost to history.
Exactly. Authors like Charlotte Smith, Maria Edgeworth, they were big deals back then, but no one really remembers them now.
I mean, it makes sense, right? Like, history is written by the winners and all that.
Right, and it just shows how, like, even in the literature, there's this bias against women.
Absolutely. So this book is bringing them back into the spotlight.
Exactly.
Love it. Giving credit where credit is due.
Okay, let's talk about Peter Thiel for a second.
Oh, the PayPal guy.
That's him. So he's got this new book out, The Technological Republic, and he's basically arguing that the tech industry needs to get more involved with the military.
Oh, really? Like defense contracting and stuff.
Yeah, exactly. He thinks Silicon Valley needs to focus more on national defense.
I mean, it's a controversial take for sure.
It is. But he points out that, like, attitudes are changing and investments are starting to flow in that direction.
Like, what kind of investments?
Well, for example, Google reversed its ban on AI military applications.
Oh, wow. Really?
Yeah, and there are all these defense tech startups popping up, getting tons of funding.
So maybe Thiel's onto something.
Maybe. It's definitely something to watch. Okay, brief mention of Generation Alpha.
Generation Alpha. Who are they?
Basically, the kids born after Gen Z.
Ah, the babies.
Yeah, and it's way too early to say anything definitive about them.
But everyone's trying to figure them out, right?
Exactly. We're all obsessed with these generational labels.
Makes you wonder what label they'll come up with for the generation after Alpha.
Right. Okay, another book recommendation. Righting Wrongs by Kenneth Roth.
Kenneth Roth, the human rights guy.
Yep, that's him.
Yeah.
He spent decades working at Human Rights Watch.
Wow, so he's seen it all.
He has. And this book is basically his, like, playbook for human rights advocacy.
Okay, what's the main takeaway?
Well, he's a big believer in factual accuracy. Like, that's your most powerful weapon when you're trying to hold powerful people accountable.
Makes sense. Truth as a weapon.
Exactly. And she's not optimistic about the future either. He thinks it's getting harder and harder to defend human rights.
Yeah, I can see that.
Okay, sad news from the world of theater. Athol Fugard passed away.
Athol Fugard. Remind me who he was.
He was a South African playwright, considered the greatest of the apartheid era.
Oh, right, yeah. Powerful stuff.
His plays were all about the human impact of apartheid, the relationships, the struggles.
A real voice for the oppressed.
Absolutely. Okay, this one's a little lighter.
Okay, hit me.
So apparently India has a very different approach to airport design compared to, like, China or the Middle East.
Really? How so?
Well, they focus a lot on incorporating local identity, natural elements. They call it the terminal in a garden concept.
That's cool, like a more organic, less sterile approach.
Exactly. Very different from the, like, super modern futuristic designs you see in other places.
Yeah, like those airports that look like spaceships.
Exactly. So it just shows how, design can reflect cultural values.
Absolutely.
Okay, quick update on Walmex, which is Walmart's operations in Mexico.
How are they doing?
Not great. Inflation's hitting them hard, interest rates are rising, and there's always the threat of new tariffs from the U.S.
Yeah. Tough times for businesses south of the border.
It is. Especially compared to how Walmart's doing in the U.S., their stock is soaring.
It's a tale of two economies.
Definitely. Okay, some skepticism about Ethiopia's claims of achieving wheat self-sufficiency.
Oh, really?
Yeah, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed has been touting it as a major achievement, but independent estimates suggest they're way off.
That's concerning.
And there's this worry that, like, they're pushing monocropping too hard, which could have long-term risks.
Yeah, like depleting the soil, making the whole
Right.
system more vulnerable.
Exactly.
So it's not as rosy a picture as the government's painting.
Definitely not.
Okay.
Over in South Africa, their coalition government, the Government of National Unity,
Yeah,
well, they're having some internal squabbles, mostly about the budget.
makes sense. Coalitions are always tricky.
They are. And it seems like the ANC, the ruling party, is really trying to hold on to power.
So it's like a power struggle within the coalition.
Pretty much.
Fascinating.
Okay, quick update on the International Criminal Court.
The ICC? What are they up to?
They're moving ahead with a case against Rodrigo Duterte, the former president of the Philippines,
For what?
for the crimes committed during his drug war.
Oh, right. Yeah, that was pretty brutal.
It was. And it's interesting because the Philippines actually withdrew from the ICC treaty.
So they're basically ignoring the court.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And the U.S. under Trump has always been hostile to the ICC, too.
So the ICC's kind of going it alone on this one.
Yeah, but they're determined to hold Duterte accountable.
Good for them.
Okay, last few things. Apparently, Europe is dominating the global commodity trading game.
Really? I hadn't thought about that.
Yeah, they've got this whole infrastructure in place. It's really hard for anyone else to compete.
So they've got a lot of leverage.
They do. Okay, this one's kind of weird.
Lay it on.
There's a study that found a link between higher testosterone levels and higher pay for men.
Really? Like,
Yeah.
the more testosterone, the more money you make.
Yeah, it's a correlation, not causation, of course.
Right.
But it's interesting, and they couldn't really explain it, even after looking at things like working hours, personality traits.
So it's a bit of a mystery.
It is, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, and finally, there's this documentary called Tune Out the Noise.
Okay, what's it about?
It's about the history of passive investing and how it all kind of started by chance at the University of Chicago.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, like a bunch of random events led to this whole revolution in financial theory.
So it's like